Hello and grand rising to you. Welcome to Wake Up Investigates with me, journalist and broadcaster Sonia Poulton. We are on episode 150. Thank you for being here. It is the 26th of September, 2025, wherever you're watching us, whether you're watching us live on Catch Up, whether you're on YouTube, X, Rumble or Spotify. Thank you for being here. I very much appreciate it. And as I say, grand rising and welcome to the show that doesn't need a complicit handshake to investigate what matters to us in public life. Yes, indeed, we are continuing our series on secretive groups that influence the UK. And today I want to turn to the daddy of them all, Freemasons. Yes, indeed, long held power around the world and none more so US and the UK. Thank you for all your wonderful chats already. Lovely to see you. Absolutely magnificent. And thank you, June. June says she's going to be watching it on Rumble to build up the numbers there. Thank you. I appreciate that. And wonderful to have you all with us. And thank you, Swiss Miss, who's going to be checking back in later. Thank you for your early super sticker. I very much appreciate it. And good morning to you all. Lovely to see you. Okay, what is there to say, really? Well, recent reports have suggested that Freemasonry is on the decline, that its power and its numbers are depleting and dwindling as Freemasonic generations are dying off and not being replaced. But is that true? Has Freemasonry really started to lose its power, which has been in existence for hundreds of years? This report will look at how Freemasonry has influenced British public life. And as I say, we are primarily focused on the UK today, but US when it comes to the entertainment sphere and Hollywood. We are told that Freemasonry isn't the force that it used to be because, as I say, the elders are apparently dying off and younger generations are not interested in the regalia and rituals of Freemasonry. But I'm not convinced that's true. Is the reality what it always was in my lifetime? And that is Freemasonry continues to touch every area of public life. And in that, I'm talking about it has a royal influence, it has a police influence, a political influence, a media influence, a financial influence, an entertainment industry influence. We will also later on in the show be going slightly deeper into the occult side, including Satanism. Now, I don't claim to be a Freemason scholar, but I've been researching Freemasons ever since I bought this book in 1990. This book is called The Brotherhood, and I will be talking a bit more about this shortly. So first of all, let me just check you can all hear me perfectly in the comments. No issues with sound or anything. Markinson said it's everywhere. Indeed it is. And that is what we're going to explore. And we're also going to look at what has happened in the UK regarding Freemasonry and why we still know so very little about it. And sound is fine. Great. Thank you. All fantastic. Thank you so much, Synchronized Soul. Do you, Mels? Mels has that book too. All good. Excellent. Right. Well, let's continue. There are approximately 225,000 to 230,000 Freemasons in the UK. That comprises about 200,000 male members under the United Grand Lodge of England, also known as UGLE. There are 30,000 members in the Grand Lodge of Scotland, 20,000 members in the Grand Lodge of Ireland, and around 5,000 members in the two female-only Grand Lodges in England. And England's 200,000 members meet in around 7,000 lodges throughout the country. And of course, when it comes to symbolism, you can't beat Freemasonry, really. Here's the square and compass, which it's very famously known for. Freemasonry is also very famously known for its charitable works. They tell us service has always been a core principle of Freemasonry, and they take great pride in their 300-year history of actively supporting those in need. Their members play a crucial role at local, national, and global levels each year. This is what they have to tell us. And they dedicate both their time and resources to make a tangible difference to various organizations and communities. Sounds like a lot of management speak, doesn't it? But the reality is Freemasonry is actually a massive money spinner when it comes to charity. Freemasons donate approximately £1 million per week into the British economy. £1 million per week. You don't need to be a mathematician to work out that's about 52 million a year. In addition, members actively engage in volunteer work in the community. Some of the donations, incidentally, go to local air ambulances, go to blood bikes, obviously carting around blood from one location to another. They provide emergency response vehicles, including super aerial platforms for the London Fire Brigade. Now, you may be saying, why do we need charity? Aren't we paying for all of that? Well, yeah, this is my long-standing issue to do with charity, because charity compromises us. We're already paying through our taxes for multiple things that the Freemasons are covering in terms of charitable concerns. And that immediately sets up an issue of potentially being compromised. Freemasonry also does a huge amount of work for the medical sphere. They do work into cancer, into diabetes, into heart disease, a whole range of other conditions, including Alzheimer's. They fund UK medical scientists. Now, again, this is very much mainstream funding that is taking place. Allopathic medicine, surgery, not particularly interested in anything natural or exploring that side. This is about funding big pharmaceuticals, of course. And more recently, money has been raised to help, for example, people to do with the Grenfell Tower disaster. So yes, Freemasonry is famous for being socially caring, and the Brotherhood, which is what they're called. Even the female leaders are called brothers, by the way. The Order of Women Freemasons, the Grand Master, is known as the most worshipful brother, Jean Michel Knight. So let's talk a little bit about what Freemasonry is on the surface. So Freemasonry consists of fraternal groups. They trace their origins to medieval guilds of stonemasons. Freemasonry is considered the oldest existing secular fraternal organization in the world. Modern Freemasonry broadly consists of three main traditions. You have the Anglo-American style Freemasonry, and that the idea is that every member should profess a belief in a supreme being, that only men should be admitted, and discussion of religion or politics does not take place within the lodge. That is one of the versions. Then you have the Continental Freemasonry, or what is often known as liberal style Freemasonry. And it's continued to evolve beyond these basic restrictions that have been the tradition of Freemasonry. And then you have other degrees, orders, and bodies. And so the sort of starting point is the blue lodges, known as craft lodges, in the United Kingdom, and they offer only the three traditional degrees. So that's 1, 2, and 3 degree. And if you want to go beyond that, and that's where it starts to get interesting, you see at the 1, 2, and 3 degree of Masons, they're the people in the community. They're the ones who are helping sick and disabled in the community. And it's once you start to go beyond the craft lodges, the blue lodges, that things slightly change. And the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite is a system, for example, of 33 degrees. It includes the 3 Blue Lodge degrees, which is administered by the local or national Supreme Council. You have to become a Master Mason of the Blue Lodge, which is the 3rd degree, in other words, a 3rd degree Mason, to attain any of the Scottish or York Rite degrees. The Scottish Rite system is popular in North America, South America, and also in continental Europe. In America, the York Rite administers 3 orders of Masonry, namely the Royal Arch, the Cryptic Masonry, and the Knights Templar. And in Britain, you have separate bodies which administer each other. Freemasons are encouraged to join, for example, the Holy Royal Arch, which is linked to Mark Masonry in Scotland and Ireland. It's a complex system. Which is why when people talk about Freemasonry, it is often the case that people in the Blue Lodge stage of 1 to 3 degrees are not privy to what is going on further up the degrees. That is the reality. Much of what we are witnessing today in public life, when people talk about how things are falling apart, a perfect example, I think, of Freemasonry in action is the fact that digital ID is now firmly on the table. And one of the most well-known expressions of 33-degree Freemasonry is ordo ab chao, order out of chaos. It implies the action of a principle of order, the chaos from which each of us comes, symbolizing the suffering and disarray of the human spirit. And they are here to make it right. They are here to make it right. And so I think that it is fair to say that much of what we see is order out of chaos. You could also call it the Hegelian dialectic. Problem, reaction, solution. It is a similar principle, a similar theme. And of course, many of the things that we know about Freemasonry includes sort of the regalia, what people are wearing. A Masonic floor, for one example, is a black and white checkered pattern known as the Masonic pavement. Let me just see if I can bring in a good and worthy Masonic floor. These appear everywhere in Freemasonic halls. And actually, I think we've already got that. Let me just see. You know how it goes, people. Oh, maybe not. Maybe I'll come back to that, actually. Maybe I'll come back to that. But you know what I'm talking about. And actually, what I will do is I will extend it slightly further later into where you see the black and white checks all over society. So the idea is that the black and white Freemasonic checkered pattern that is on all their floors represents the good and evil of human life. Then, of course, let me just bring in some of this regalia so you can get an idea of some of the things they wear. They wear aprons. The idea is that the modern Masonic apron evolved from practical leather aprons worn by medieval stonemasons. The idea was to protect their clothing from dust and wear, and it now serves as a symbolic garment worn for honor and to signify devotion to the fraternity's principles. That's their words, not mine. Then, of course, they famously wear white gloves. And they wear white gloves. This is a symbol of purity. Add some words to the effect that the symbol of purity. And so what happens is once you start to make your way through the degrees of masonry, you are awarded these white gloves, and that the gloved hand is the idea is that you're purified by the initiation and you must never be sullied again. That is the idea. Already it starts to sound very creepy to me. And Freemasonry began, we heard about the first Grand Lodge established to govern Freemasonry in England and Wales was formed in 1717. But Scotland has had a Masonic lodge in Edinburgh since its existence, at least 1599, so ahead of England and Wales. And one question that people ask is, if they do such good work, why are they so secretive? So Freemasonry models itself upon, as I say, the fraternities of medieval stonemasons who would use secret words and symbols to recognize each other's legitimacy. And we see that, don't we? We see in Freemasonry, we see the secret handshakes. They're big on symbolism, massively big, which we will talk about so much more as I go through this. But the reality is there are persistent suspicions that Freemasons, and they are one of the most secretive of groups. They are actually a secret group in many key respects, and worse than ever before, I should say. And I'll explain why I say that. So there are suspicions that they remain secretive in order to conceal the ways in which they can assist each other in business, covering for each other, covering for corruption, etc. Freemasonry isn't a religion, it's a secular movement, although new members are expected to acknowledge a belief in a godlike superior being. Anyone believing in a single deity may also be admitted. So if you say, I believe in a creator, all of those things, you are already on the path to being a Freemason. So Are identities of all Freemasons kept secret? Well, to a certain degree, but individual Freemasons can declare themselves if they wish, and they almost never do. The names of senior members in the Brotherhood in England and Wales can be found in a Masonic yearbook. However, the vast majority of Freemasons do not disclose their membership outside of the Brotherhood. And you have to wonder why. Because if they're doing so much good for the world, why wouldn't they be shouting about it more? So the board, let me see if I can bring in some information on the board. I think the board is interesting. The board is made up of the Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, as both Grand Master of the Craft and First Grand Principal of the Royal Arch. Let me find a picture of him. Here he is. He's been in that post forever and a day. He served as the Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England since 1967. He's the organization's longest serving Grand Master. And he is a member of the Royal Arch, which is the culmination of the Masonic journey for many people. And he's been a member of the order, as I say, forever, and he's participated in his ceremonies. But he's not alone when it comes to royals, far from alone. Prince Philip is a typical example of someone who's high up in royalty and a Freemason. In fact, he was part of the Navy Lodge 2612. And there are many questions over whether Prince Charles, when Prince Philip died, over whether Prince Charles would, to a degree, inherit his role. Now, they won't confirm or deny this. It has long been known that Charles followed after Lord Louis Mountbatten. Lord Louis Mountbatten was somebody who didn't like the Freemasons, but there were other members of the royal family who did. And that is why, for example, that Prince Philip became a Freemason in order for him to be able to marry Elizabeth. Elizabeth became a patroness of the Grand Lodge, even though as a woman, she couldn't step foot inside the place. This just tells you so much about what's taking place, really, so much. And joining isn't that simple, right? Even though if you go to the United Grand Lodge website, there'll be like online forms to find out more and to join, as if it's that simple. Actually, the process of joining a Masonic lodge follows similar general patterns worldwide. And this is really important to understand, because many people don't get this. People think that Freemasonry is some monolith, that they all follow the same rules, they all wear the same clothes. No, that's not true. Individual lodges have their own rituals and customs and clothing as well, depending on country, depending on region. And historically, candidates were not, and I'm quoting from the Freemasons here, were not to be admitted but by unanimous consent. That already tells you it's not as simple, right, as filling out a form online. So what happens is there is an initial approach made to people. In the early days of Freemasonry, one had to be approached and what they called co-opted to the fraternity by an existing member. But they had ultimately, the person who had been approached had to do it of his own free will and accord. So approached by Freemans, but can only enter according to their own free will and accord. And this tradition continues in many jurisdictions, mainly in Europe, Africa, and South America. However, other jurisdictions take a completely opposite approach to this. They require a potential candidate to express an interest before being invited to join. But it is still very much an old boys club. Absolutely, it absolutely is. And that is friends bring in friends. And an old Masonic term for the brother that proposes a candidate to the lodge is that he becomes his godfather after invitation. So once initial contact is established, the candidate is typically introduced to the lodge through sponsorship, which is essentially by finding two members to sign the petition the top line signer becoming the godfather of this man that they want to enter into the Brotherhood. There's a preliminary phrase. This can last from weeks to months to years, depending on the lodge and jurisdiction, and generally includes several informal meetings to establish mutual trust and clarify expectations. In other words, are you the type of person who can keep our secrets? Following the introduction, an investigation into the person who wants to join the Freemasons is generally started. This is clearly not as simple as filling in an online form, right? Candidates can be invited to a series of interviews with various lodge officers or designated members. These meetings, often 3 in number. 3 is a key number in Freemasonry, which is a bit of a problem because 3 is also my favorite number. And actually, in tarot, as one example, you see Freemasonry throughout all contemporary life. And in tarot, the 3 of Pentacles is very much about the stonemason, as one example, because Freemasonry is littered throughout popular culture. After those meetings with potentially 3 people observing the person who wants to be brought into the Brotherhood, there is the formal application and balloting. This is not a simple protest. They vet people. They really do. Now, if both the candidate and the lodge wish to proceed after these preliminary steps, which can take, as I say, weeks, months, or years, a formal application may be proposed and seconded, or seconded rather, or announced in the open lodge, and more informal interviews will then follow. If the candidate wishes to proceed beyond this, and I think probably most of them do, because by this point they're starting to understand there is a great deal to be gained by becoming a Freemason, certainly in the local area, then what happens after that is references are then taken up during a period of notice so that members may inquire into the candidate's suitability and discuss it. But I can tell you that being a criminal does not stop you becoming part of the Freemasons, because that is absolutely proven, more of which shortly. Following that, there's so much to this. The initiation process is insane. Following these investigations, some individual lodges then implement a significant procedural step known as passing under the blindfold, or sometimes the low door. Now, what this involves is the candidate is then blindfolded, is introduced to the lodge and the members, and must answer questions posed by the members. And one of the reasons that they say that the people are blindfolded is because if this candidate doesn't get past this round, then they won't know who said what, and they won't know who they could perhaps take revenge on or target, as one example. But they also, the suggestion is that by having the candidate blindfolded, it becomes an easier, less political affair. I'm not convinced. I think it's part of their weird rituals. Well, it is part of their weird rituals. And after that, after the blindfolding stage, the lodge takes an officially secret ballot on each application before a candidate is either initiated into the craft or rejected. And if you want to know where some terminology that is in modern parlance comes from, one example is blackballed. That is a perfect example that comes from Freemasonry. And the ballot, for example, traditionally used white balls, which was favorable. Yes, this candidate can join the Freemasons. Or they used black balls, which were unfavorable. And that gave rise to the expression blackballed, which describes obviously people being rejected, and usually being rejected because some sort of whispering that has taken place in the background. Anyway, after a successful passage through all of this, the investigation process, favorable vote, the initiation ceremony then marks the candidate's official entry into Freemasonry. So it's a lot. It's a lot more than filling out a form online, and can take years. Although not for royals, they generally skip these steps with speed, with great haste. And the eligibility requirements vary, as I say, depending on jurisdiction, what part of the world, where the location is, for example. But in typical Anglo-American style Freemasonry lodge, such as the United Grand Lodge of England, which is really what we're focusing on today, candidates must typically be male, be freeborn men of mature age, usually 21 years, although some jurisdictions permit at the age of 18. They must believe in a supreme being, although they can have their own interpretation as to what this is. They must be of good reputation of character. Now, that's a lie. That's a lie, because Freemasons have readmitted criminals who have gone to prison. And one of the other things is they must be unmutilated, although that is not followed in most jurisdictions these days. And as I say, Grand Lodges in this tradition insist that you must declare a belief in a supreme being. And in a few cases, and again, this varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but in a few cases, the candidate may be required to be of a specific religion. So for one example, Freemasonry in Scandinavia, known as the Swedish Rite, they only accept Christians. That's just one example. The lodge. We hear a lot about a lodge, don't we? There is no international worldwide Grand Lodge that supervises all of Freemasonry. Each Grand Lodge is independent, and they do not necessarily even recognize each other as being legitimate. They are their own worlds within worlds. And let us talk a little bit about the degrees. The start of Freemasonry, as I've said earlier, are the 3 grades, and these are based on medieval craft guilds. So you have the entered apprentice when they first enter Freemasonry. Then they go on to journeyman or fellow of the craft. And the 3rd degree, when they've completed the Blue Lodges, is the Master Mason. And it is the candidate of these 3 degrees is essentially progressively taught the meanings of the symbols of Freemasonry. They're entrusted with what the grips mean, what the signs and words signify to other members. It's a secret code. It's a secret code. And many people are curious as to what happens at their meetings and gatherings. Well, very little is known about what happens at their meetings and gatherings. And part of the reason that there's so much suspicion around them is not only because historically in England, Freemasonry has been linked to corruption, and evidentially so, as I will show. But everything is surrounded with such secrecy. So their meetings, the Masonic Lodge meets regularly. The idea is that they conduct various business. They perform Masonic ceremonies. They confer Masonic degrees on each other. They receive lectures on Masonic history and rituals. They read Masonic papers, and they share personal Masonic experiences. That's what we are told goes on at the Masonic Lodge. I have taught with whistleblower Masons before, and they tell a slightly different tale of people doing business, of taking care of each other, of making deals of corruption. And at the conclusion of many of the meetings, the lodge may hold a dinner called an agape or a festive board. And it sometimes involves toasting and a song. These meetings are typically held in a Masonic temple, though other venues may occasionally be used. And I don't know whether it's agape or agate, but you get it's a festive board. So all of it, obviously, we're talking about a great deal of symbolism, tradition that takes place in an extremely secretive environment where we are told entry is as easy as filling out a form online. As if. And let me return back to this. One of the seminal books on Freemasonry is this one, The Brotherhood. It was written by Stephen Knight. It was published in 1984, at a time when Freemasonry was coming under increasing scrutiny in the United Kingdom. In 1983, Stephen Knight actually became a religious follower of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and as a part of this took the name Swami Puja Debal, but he was known as Stephen Knight on this. Now, he also wrote about Jack the Ripper and the killing of a judge. Knight's last book before his death was The Killing of Justice Godfrey. It explored the death of Edmund Berry Godfrey in 1678, which had caused widespread anti-Catholic sentiment in England. But here's where it gets interesting. And this is not the first occasion that this has happened. When I decided this week that this was going to be our second part, and I decided that in part because, thankfully, England over the last few weeks has finally woken up to the issues of the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society was going to be our part 2. I've covered the Fabian Society quite extensively before, including a report into it, but I was going to do that as part 2. But then I saw that everybody and his dog was suddenly looking at the Fabian Society. And I thought, well, that's great, because we all need to know more about that. And so I'm going to cover the daddy of them all, as I say, Freemasonry. But what is really interesting, which blew my mind yesterday when I realized it, is today would be Stephen Knight's birthday, the 26th of September. The book, as I say, was first published in it's difficult to know whether it was 1983 or 1984. In the year that it was published in a paperback, 1985, Stephen Knight died. He was 33. Now, many people have made a great deal of that. But first of all, I thought it was really eerie to discover that it would be his birthday today. He was born in 1951, 26th of September, 1951. So I felt that there was like a calling. It was almost like Stephen was calling me to continue lifting the lid, which he had done incredible work on. This is an incredible book. Highly, highly recommended. But as I say, in the year it was first published as a paperback, which was 1985, that was when he died. And there have been many conspiracies about his death, because at the age of 33, a man who had written a deep expose about Freemasonry died. And soon after the publishing of the paperback. So that was weird. But actually what it was he began to experience epileptic seizures in 1977. And in 1980, he was discovered to have a brain tumor while taking part in a BBC show, Horizon, the Horizon television series. The tumor was removed, but returned in 1984. These are all very symbolic dates. Of course, 1984, George Orwell, age 33 degree Mason, the fact that he died when it went into paperback, all of this I think is really interesting and significant. And what happened was that he passed away in July 1985 while staying with friends in Carradale, Argyll in Scotland. And he's left this incredible legacy behind. Happy Earth Day to you, Stephen. I hope you're listening somewhere up there. And just know that I've taken a great deal of, research, information, background understanding over decades from your seminal work. And obviously, Knight had extensively researched Freemasonry. And when he wrote his book on Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, he suggested that the Ripper murders was part of a conspiracy between Freemasons and the British royal family. That's what he concluded in his book about Jack the Ripper. So let's talk about the royal family a little bit more. I talked briefly about how Prince Philip had been a Mason, and there was talk about whether Charles would assume the role left by his father, Prince Philip. And as I said, Lord Louis Mountbatten hated the Freemasons and influenced Charles. The Queen Mother also disliked Freemasonry, but her husband, King George VI, was heavily into it. And actually, as I said, wouldn't let Elizabeth II and Philip marry if he didn't join, which he later did. And as I say, the Queen became the grand patroness of the Masons. And it's interesting to know whether Charles is or isn't, because Lord Louis Mountbatten was his favourite uncle when he was growing up. He influenced him greatly, as I covered in a recent Wake Up investigation. And he influenced him to such a degree that Charles chose not to join Freemasonry in his youth and early adulthood. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if that has changed now. Not at all surprised. It's kings actually have held a position, senior positions within Freemasonry for a very long time. Very long time. And there are many, many famous Freemasons throughout history. Famous kings, many US presidents and politicians, from George Washington to Winston Churchill. Then you had very famous authors such as Mark Twain and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. You had inventors like Alexander Fleming as one example. You had historic entertainers like Wolfgang Amadeus, like Mozart. And then you had explorers like Buzz Aldrin as one example. Then there were huge leaders like J. Edgar Hoover, former director of the FBI, absolutely aware and involved with what was going on with the murder of JFK. And then you had, actors and musicians like Nat King Cole, John Wayne, very famous cowboy actor. It goes on and on and on. And here's what's interesting to me, I think, is that the United Grand Lodge are very happy to talk about historic, famous Freemasons. There you see Prince Philip there. Very happy to talk about them. What they're not happy to talk about are the current ones. Because it's important to note that information on Freemason membership is often private, and many reports of celebrity Freemasons today are unconfirmed. They simply won't confirm them. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more shortly. But during some of my research to do with Madeleine McCann, I went to the Grand Lodge to inquire as to whether Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and Jerry McCann were Freemasons. And they were very nice, and they invited me to the Grand Lodge in Covent Garden, but they would neither confirm nor deny that. And I'm going to talk more about that towards the end. But there has long been rumors, and some people don't hide it. Here's a perfect example of somebody who's very famous, who has not hidden his affiliation. Let me just find. And it's interesting because this individual always goes on the same holiday and had done for years. You can see Simon Cowell. This is not something that he would publicly confirm, but you can clearly see that there is the square and compass on the front of his, whatever that's called, I'll call it a water vehicle. There's a other name for it, which I'm sure you'll tell me in the comments, but clearly that is Freemasonic. Clearly there are other people like Ashton Kutcher, for one example. He's often mentioned in discussions about celebrity Masons, though again, membership unconfirmed. Jay-Z, another one. Freemasonry, well, they like to get away from the idea that they are a secret society, but they are extremely private. And the reality is members often prefer to keep their affiliations private. And Jimmy Savile was long rumored to be a Freemason, with Freemasons attending his funeral. And it was said that Savile had become a member of Leeds Lodge number 9867, but again, never officially confirmed. But the reality is, and this is important for people to understand, is Freemasonry has not changed in regards to the fact that it is never far from the seat of power. Never far. Politicians and journalists are absolutely involved and at the heart and senior levels in Freemasonry. In the heart of Westminster, our political district, 2 Freemason lodges set up more than 80 plus years ago now for members of parliament and political journalists. You have the New Welcome Lodge number 5139. That's a British Masonic lodge. It's open to all men working in the Palace of Westminster. In other words, politicians and their advisors. At its founding, members were limited only to Labour Party members, but it's broadened considerably since then and is now open across party. Then you have the Gallery Lodge, number 1928. That was established for members of the Political Press Corps, which is often known as the lobby. Both these lodges remain active. There's a third lodge, incidentally, called the Alfred Robbins Lodge, which was also set up for journalists. And that also continues to meet regularly in London. And the identities of the members of all 3 lodges remain unknown outside the world of Freemasonry. These are people who are deciding our laws, who are writing our media, who are pumping out propaganda. They're so secretive, in fact, that when I've talked to members of the lobby, whom I'm pretty certain are not part of Freemasonry, they don't even know who is involved. Now, it could well be that the people I've talked to are absolutely Freemasons, and it is part of the protocol the modus operandi to even deny its very existence. Its very existence. A few years back, the chief executive of the United Grand Lodge said that contrary to populist perception, being a Freemason helps those members in roles serving society in the broader sense, including journalists, politicians, policemen, and lawyers, to be better in those jobs by encouraging them to act as better people themselves. Their membership is a positive for both them as individuals and for society at large. Yeah, but why do we know about them then? And this is a continuing theme that you will see throughout this, the problems about a lack of transparency about this organization. They say that one of the reasons that they need to remain as sort of secretive as they do is that they are subject to prejudice and discrimination. The notion is that if more Freemasons would declare their membership, if they were not so fearful of prejudice and discrimination, but I'm not convinced, not at all. Secrecy, the reality is secrecy enables suspicion, and they have long known it. They've long known it, hundreds of years. Yet, throughout the years, when a light has been shone on the organization, they do everything they can to double down in their secrecy and even go after individuals who seek to highlight Freemasonry. In Westminster, MPs and peers, lords, are not obliged to declare their membership of the Freemasons, although the Commons authorities say they can disclose this information voluntarily on the registers of members and lords' financial interests. Voluntarily. None currently do so, or at least I couldn't find one. Nor do any political journalists declare their membership of the Freemasons on the register of journalists' interests, which is maintained by Parliament. So it's a big club, and you and I ain't in it. So let's look at that secrecy. Secret handshakes, cover-ups, and criminality. There's no better place to start than Operation Tiberius. You might not have heard of Operation Tiberius. It was a secret police operation into Freemasons. It was a 2002 internal London Metropolitan Police investigation, which was leaked to the Independent newspaper in 2014. It found that criminal organizations had used Freemasonry connections to recruit corrupt officers. What happened is the Parliamentary Home Affairs Committee had published a redacted copy of a summary of the investigation, and it detailed other earlier corruption investigations, including but not limited to Operation Russell, which investigated the charge that certain organized criminals, as it stated in the report, were able to infiltrate Scotland Yard at the heart of British policing by bribery. 19 former and 42 then serving officers were investigated for alleged corruption. Some of Britain's most dangerous organised crime syndicates were able to infiltrate New Scotland Yard at will. At will. There was evidence of all manner of interference, evidence tampering. There was interference with the pursuit of criminal suspects by other forces. There was close cooperation with senior cops and senior criminals, particularly those involved in drugs, prostitution, racketeering, you name it. There were charges that jurors were being bought off or threatened to return not guilty verdicts on these criminals that eventually did get in the dock. There were corrupt individuals working for Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, both in the UK and overseas. Get out of jail free cards were said to be being bought for £50,000, which was also cited in the report. This is significant, and yet people didn't know about it. One unnamed Met senior investigating officer wrote and was quoted in the report, "I feel that at the current time, I cannot carry out an ethical murder investigation without the fear of it being compromised." These are serious charges, and I've had them corroborated over and over again. One is by Dave Eden. Dave Eden is a former Metropolitan Police cop. He's in my film Paedophiles in Parliament. I referred to him earlier this week when I was talking to Izzy Vine, the police whistleblower. Dave Eden witnessed so much, including a special constable who was also bringing in prostitutes. He witnessed so much, he whistle blew on so much, and he was, of course, ostracized and threatened. But the complicity runs deep. And I'll tell you why, because you'd think after Operation Tiberius and Operation Russell, which you probably never heard about, the BBC screened an edition of Panorama, which covered police corruption, and they included material from Operation Tiberius. But guess what the BBC did? They failed to reveal the connection to Freemasonry, which was huge. The BBC failed to join that dots for its viewers. Why would they do that? No mention of the involvement of Freemasonry in a report about a secret police report to do with corrupt Freemasonry within the forces. What? And the BBC didn't make that connection? It seemed absolutely clear then as now that a Masonic lodge was and is strongly influencing the BBC. Ultimately, despite BBC bias, Operation Tiberius found that underworld syndicates used their contacts to recruit corrupted officers inside Scotland Yard, and concluded it was one of the most difficult aspects of organised crime corruption to proof against. The Tiberius report had been marked secret, and it found that serving officers in East Ham, East London, who were members of the Freemasons, attempted to find out which detectives were suspected of links to organised crime. And this was from other police sources who were also involved in Freemasonry. But you think it's all over, don't you? Maybe not. Wake Up viewers are very savvy and very sussed. Of course it's not. The reality is that Freemasonry, famous for its, famous for lots of things, rituals, including its secret handshakes, and we see them, don't we? Freemasonry has long been suspected of having members who work in the criminal justice system, notably the judiciary and the police. Operation Tiberius absolutely revealed that. And the political establishment, the judicial establishment, they dismiss these things. Conspiracy theories concocted by people who want to believe that we're wicked and that we are letting each other off from corruption. It was actually shown. It was proven. It was proven. That Operation Tiberius, Operation Russell, they were not the only police reports that revealed links, by the way. There was Project Riverside, which was a 2008 report by the Serious Organised Crime Agency. And that also claimed that criminals attempted to corrupt police officers through Freemason members. And the idea was that they used this corruption in a bid to further their own interests within the force and within Freemasonry. And there, for a very long time, actually, for decades now, there have been calls for more transparency around public officials and Freemasonry. And we kind of almost had that 1998, which I want to talk about in more depth in a bit. We kind of had that when former Home Secretary Jack Straw ordered that all police officers and judges should declare membership of the organization. Now, Jack Straw is not a man I would trust. I have doorstepped him. He's been involved in a number of extremely questionable dealings, and eventually the whole thing was dropped under threat of legal action. But I want to talk a little bit more about that shortly. There has been a routine lack of transparency, as you would imagine, and none more so than from this man. This is not going to surprise anybody. If I can just bring in an image of him. Let me just see if I've got him here. Oops, that seemed to have just jumped for some reason. Oops, no, bear with me. Let's just, can I find you? There you are. There you are. Come on, Mr. Man, you're coming with me. This man who actually, this will tell you so much about the continuing influences of Freemasonry. But this man, London Mayor Sadiq Khan has done everything he can to stop transparency around Freemasons. I know that won't surprise you. You only have to look at the fruits of this man's labour, okay, and what he has done to London. But in 2016, as London Mayor, he refused to force Metropolitan Police officers to declare membership of the Freemasons, saying such a move would be illegal. And that's outrageous because by that point in 2016, he had so many references to draw on, including the Hillsborough disaster when it comes to Freemasonry, which I will cover in detail today. But Sadiq Khan had so many references to draw on about Freemasonry and corruption and the importance of a public register of Freemasons. And yet he ruled out a compulsory register of Freemasonry in the Metropolitan Police, which is the largest police force in England and Wales. He was, and actually, what was outrageous, so he was asked, I think it was by a member of the Dems, asked about this transparent list that would show members of the Metropolitan Police. And as I say, it wasn't like he didn't have evidence to draw on that there had been significant corruption in the Metropolitan Police, excuse me, at the hands of Freemasonry. I'm going to read you part of his written response. Let me just have a drink of this. In his written response, he stated, "The Met is bound by the legislation of the Police Regulations Act 2003, which states that no restrictions other than those designed to secure the proper exercise of the functions of a constable shall be imposed on the private life of members of a police force." This is semantics, and he knew it, because the reality is the private goings on of a lot of these officers were impacting their roles in public life. Okay, absolutely, unquestionably, then as now, officers should declare whether they are Freemasons or not. And what happened prior to that, in 2014, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, has said that human rights laws had made a compulsory register difficult. And he said, for me, as a police officer, the secrecy of membership is a concern. I think police officers should be transparent, nothing to hide, then why not mention it? My view would be that you ought to be open about your associations. Well, chances are that Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe was not a Freemason. And although they are few and far between when it comes to in the police. And I want to focus a huge amount on the police and our law today. And it could be a continuation of a series, but I think it's really important too, because this is the bedrock of our nation, right? Our law, what is taking place, transparency, to see that justice is done, all of these things. I want to go back to when Labour attempted to push through a voluntary register of Masonic police officers. And the idea was that they wanted a voluntary register from the 32 English and Welsh forces. That was 1999. However, more than 2/3 of rank and file officers did not respond or refused to participate. Imagine, okay? Of the 36.6% of officers who agreed to be involved, only 1.1% admitted to being Freemasons. I mean, it's farcical because they've enabled it to be farcical. The Home Office at the time estimated that the true figure of Freemasons in police was going to be at least 10 times higher, and some, I would say. And then it tried the voluntary register after a Home Affairs Committee report, which actually had cleared Freemasonry of being a primary cause of a 1970s miscarriage of justice by the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad. But it noted at the time, we cannot entirely exclude the possibility that it may have been a contributory factor. You think? So going back to Jack Straw, after that voluntary register failed, the Home Office, then under Home Secretary Jack Straw, issued a consultation paper. It floated the idea of a compulsory register. That compulsory register. And when the Metropolitan Police Authority sounded out serving officers about this in 2000, it was told many people regarded the request to disclose Freemasonry membership as an invasion of their privacy. So then what happened was the Labour government dropped plans for a compulsory register. And that was after threats from the United Grand Lodge that they would use the 1998 Human Rights Act to challenge it. So that's kind of like as close as we've got to any serious transparency, which is outrageous. It's actually outrageous that you can have people in such senior positions in public life in our nation, and we can't necessarily know about their affiliations, which long have links to corruptions and cover-up. People have long been compromised from within in terms of the police. For example, John Tully, who was chairman of the Metropolitan Police Federation between 2012 and 2015, when he left his post, he started working as an administrator at the United Grand Lodge of England. And he said that his personal view was that a register of police Freemasons would be unhelpful. And that was when he was still chairman of the Metropolitan Police Federation, because he's a Mason, right? He said, who is going to benefit? Where is the evidence to say there has been a Masonic conspiracy in any investigation? I can't think of one where Masonic conspiracy has been proven to have changed the nature of an investigation. He admitted that he was a Mason. He said it's been widely publicized, and I'm not ashamed of it. I'm quite proud of it, actually. The Freemasons are the second biggest giver to charity after the National Lottery. There's that charity word again, you see. And we've known throughout a very long period of time that people have used charity as a cover to hide what their real intentions are, their real nefarious intentions are. Mr. Tully said at the time that singling out Freemasons when people could have loyalties to a whole host of other organizations, such as golf clubs, did not make sense. Kind of different, although a lot of Freemasons golf, right? But the fact remains, there have long been issues of Freemasons in the police and alleged criminality. That is a reality. And I want to start, first of all, looking at the story of Daniel Morgan. You may or may not be familiar with Daniel Morgan. I've interviewed his brother, Alistair Morgan, before. The unsolved murder of private detective Daniel Morgan. Let's bring in an image of him because it may remind you. There have been documentaries made about Daniel Morgan. Here he is. Here's Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan is one of the UK's most notorious cold cases. There was a damning report into police failure, which was 8 years in the making. Daniel Morgan was murdered with an axe in the car park of the Golden Lion pub in Sydenham, southeast London in March 1987. And the panel found that there were multiple very significant failings in the investigation from the moment his body was discovered. It was revealed that the handling of the murder scene was totally inadequate. It was not searched. It was left unguarded. All of these things. Now, this would not be on the first occasion when we've seen crime scenes not closed off, crime scenes interfered with. Well, that was the case when it came to Daniel Morgan. And there is also some evidence that existed that some of those arrested in connection with the murder in April 1987 may have been alerted the day before by a leak to the media. That was also found by the Daniel Morgan panel. There's a catalogue of disasters that took place. Alibis were not sought for the suspects. Search warrants were seriously inadequate. Lines of inquiry were not followed through properly. And the panel said that many of the opportunities which were lost were not retrievable. There was an inquest in April 1988. It heard evidence from a man who claimed Mr. Morgan's business partner, Jonathan Rees, had asked him if he knew anyone who could kill the private detective. And there was more regarding that. Kevin Lemon also claimed that Mr. Rees had told him in 1986 that Catford police officers would carry out the murder of Mr. Morgan, or they would arrange it, and that Detective Sergeant Sid Fillery was quite aware that Mr. Morgan was going to be killed. And the panel noted, despite this, The coroner said inaccurately that he had heard no evidence whatsoever to the point that any police involvement in the murder and that no stone had been left unturned during the investigation. Interesting, isn't it? No stone left unturned. If there was ever an expression that kind of sums up a lot of Freemasonry, that could well be it. The independent panel were not at all happy with the coroner, with what took place, with the problems when it came to the investigation. The independent panel ultimately said they had not found enough evidence to prove police involvement in Mr. Morgan's death. No one has ever been brought to justice over Daniel Morgan's death because primarily evidence of police involvement in the murder was not pursued. Not pursued. There was a second police investigation into Mr. Morgan's murder that was conducted by Hampshire Constabulary. There's been a number of investigations, in fact. The panel found that the investigation did not pursue, I'm quoting directly now, did not pursue to the fullest extent possible evidence that serving or former police officers were involved in the murder, or whether they committed crimes unconnected to the killing or had been guilty of disciplinary offences. There was, however, some evidence that this was deliberate conduct on the part of the Hampshire investigation. Close association between officers and individuals linked to crime was recognised. There was evidence of a culture within the Metropolitan Police in 1987, which allowed this very close association between officers on the team investigating Daniel Morgan's murder and individuals linked to crime, the panel found. And the panel had said that there had been suggestions since 1987 that Mr. Morgan was going to sell a story about police corruption to the media, but the nature of that corruption was never established. And it was suggested that he was going to sell that story in connection with a police officer. Now, this is where it gets very interesting because D.S. Fillery, who I'd already mentioned, was a Freemason, became master of two different lodges in 1993 and 1996, while 10 police officers who were prominent in investigations into Daniel Morgan were Freemasons. Okay, it's a considerable amount of Freemasons operating around one of the UK's longest cold cases that has never been properly solved, that lines of inquiry linking police to organised crime were never pursued. The panel said investigating officers entertained doubts as to whether Masonic loyalties, which all Freemasons swear to uphold, might conflict with those which police officers owe to each other and to the public by virtue of their office. What was interesting was Daniel Morgan was working with a cop known as Taffy Holmes. Daniel was murdered, and shortly after, Taffy Holmes was said to have died by suicide. A book was published, which was co-written with Alistair Morgan. And after that, a close associate had come forward to say that Holmes and Daniel Morgan were definitely working together on a story of police corruption. And it's really awful because what we also learned, so they actually died within 6 months of each other. So the idea was very much so that Daniel Morgan, as a private detective who was also involved with bent cops, but Daniel Morgan as a private detective was facilitating stories to tabloid media. And this also kind of embroils the hacking inquiry, the News of the World, Murdoch newspapers primarily. And many believed that Taffy Holmes was a Freemasonic killing because he was working to expose the corruption between police and Freemasons. And it is highly likely that Daniel Morgan's was as well. That remains unsolved. We're told that Taffy Holmes committed suicide. Almost certainly he didn't. Almost certainly he didn't. Because there's long been an issue in police when it comes to the corruption of Freemasonry. And honestly, none more so in many respects than those charged with the job of protecting Londoners. The Metropolitan Police is a hotbed of Freemasonic activity and has been for a very long time. In fact, I was able to trace it back at least to the 60s. And a brilliant quote, actually, in the 70s, which was said by John Simons, who was a Met officer, and he described it as he said that when officers wanted to talk about getting involved with criminals and facilitating each other, he said he talked about how he was a member of a little firm within a firm. So the Freemasons in the Metropolitan Police considered themselves to be a little firm within a firm. And a tight-knit group of police officers, they were guaranteeing immunity for criminals all around the Metropolitan Police area. And it's extraordinary because we can't actually trace how far that has gone and whether that still exists. There was the whole issue around Stephen Lawrence, for one example, which also brought forward the Macpherson report, which showed that the Metropolitan Police was institutionally racist. Issues of police corruption and criminality around that as well. The fact is, and many people, and let me be very clear here, I've worked with some good cops. There are good cops. The vast majority are not necessarily Freemasons, but there are many, many, many Freemasons in the police service. And Freemasonry and police corruption have always worked together. And none more so and none more devastating than what happened in April 1989. Anybody who was alive in 1989, lived in England, lived in the UK, will tell you that the impact of what happened at Hillsborough has rippled down the generations. It was a devastating loss of life, and there was Freemasonic involvement. The Hillsborough disaster happened inside the Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield. It happened on the 15th of April, 1989. It was a human crash, which was a result of overcrowding in central pens of the football stands, fatal crowd crush. And it occurred during an FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. Shortly before kickoff, police match commander David Duckenfield ordered exit gate C to be opened. And this was said in an attempt to ease crowding. I want to bring in this man, because this man still has a lot to answer for. It's extraordinary. It's actually extraordinary. Oh, it doesn't want me to. Let me just try that again. This man's extraordinary. You may or may not have heard of his name, but we're going to go in on David Duckenfield. This was the commander. And as I say, he ordered exit gate C to be opened, and we were told, in an attempt to ease overcrowding. And what happened was it led to an influx of supporters entering the pens, which resulted in overcrowding of those pens and the absolute fatal crush, which resulted in a total of 97 fatalities, 766 injuries. Hillsborough is still considered our deadliest sporting tragedy in British sporting history. What happened and the responses that followed were tainted with suggestions of a significant and substantial Freemasonry cover-up, given that the cop at the heart of the tragedy, this man, David Duckenfield, was a Freemason and had been for a very long time. And what happened almost immediately following absolute heinous tragedy that took place. Many of us will never forget the imagery of young people being crushed. We saw it. It was just awful. And I've obviously used far less graphic imagery here because you don't need to be re-traumatized by this. But what happened almost immediately, even though it was David Deckenfield's order that led to the crushing in those pens, that led to much of the problems that took place, there was an immediate demonization of Liverpool fans, primarily Liverpool fans. This was some shocking stuff, right? And I want to cover this. Let me just bring in it's a very famous image that followed, and many people will never forget the role of the Sun newspaper in demonizing victims of Hillsborough. Okay, so what happened was almost immediately, media began to shift the blame of what had happened at Hillsborough onto the behavior of the Liverpool fans. And the Sun newspaper, published on the 19th of April, 1989, under the editorship of the reprehensible Calvin Mackenzie, who was still out there claiming to spout truth. He was the editor at the time. He published it. He wasn't alone. There were similar such articles in the Daily Star, the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, and outrageous stuff. And the Evening Standard, London's newspaper as well, also blamed Liverpool supporters. But the Sun was probably the one that stood out the most as being the most heinous and with the most repercussions following it. So what happened? The Sun article was abundant with false allegations. Abundant. It claimed that fans pickpocketed victims as they were laying and dying, right? It said that some Liverpool fans urinated on police. It said that some Liverpool fans beat up a cop who was trying to give the kiss of life. And there's been a book which was written about the days of the Sun, and Calvin Mackenzie was has been referred to as reportedly spending 2 hours deciding on which headline to run. And one of the ones that he wanted was "You scum." You scum. After a mass casualty like that, and the truth has not yet been told. You scum. But he eventually decided on the truth. It was absolutely horrendous. It had a huge impact. It immediately swayed many people in the UK to believe that the fans had been responsible for the mass casualties at Hillsborough. And these were invisible hands working behind the scenes, because the reality was many Liverpool fans had actually helped security personnel stretcher away victims and gave first aid to the injured. Calvin Mackenzie maintained for years that his only mistake was to believe a Tory MP, and that was the Tory MP of the area who had been involved in this story. And in 1993, Calvin Mackenzie told a House of Commons committee, "I regret Hillsborough. It was a fundamental mistake. The mistake, I believe, was I believe what an MP said. You're an editor. Take some accountability, take some ownership." But he wouldn't. Calvin Mackenzie was always a filthy editor. Filthy. You'd have to be to run the Sun, right? But privately, he was actually reported to have said, "All I did wrong was tell the truth. I was not sorry then, and I'm not sorry now." Even though he has actually been forced to apologize. But you see, the thing is, Liverpool is one of those places where truly in our nation, it's very unique in many respects, is when you hurt people in Liverpool or you hurt the good name of Liverpool, Liverpudlians band together very effectively. So there was a boycott of the Sun in Merseyside, widespread boycotts throughout Merseyside. It followed immediately and actually continues to this day largely. And the boycotts included both customers refusing to purchase it and retailers refusing to stock it. And the Financial Times actually reported back in 2019 that Merseyside sales were estimated to drop from 55,000 per day to just 12,000 per day, which was a decrease of 80%. Don't mess with Liverpudlians. They were hurting so badly after Hillsborough, and to then be blamed on the front cover of Britain's largest selling newspaper was fairly shocking. In 2012, under the headline, The Real Truth, the Sun eventually made a front page apology saying, "We are profoundly sorry for false reports. Too little, too late. Too little, too late. The damage they did was incalculable." The editor at the time was Dominic Mohan. Kelvin Mackenzie had long moved on just to being a toxic, foul-mouthed, opinionated oik in, kind of giving his opinions on shows and on social media, etc. But Dominic Mohan was in charge in 2012 and said, "We published an inaccurate and offensive story about the events at Hillsborough. We said it was the truth. It wasn't. For that, we are deeply ashamed and profoundly sorry." A long time after the event, right? And James Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch's son, also made a full apology for the Sun's coverage when he appeared at the hearing of the House of Commons Select Committee in 2012. Kelvin Mackenzie issued a long statement. "Today I offer my profuse apologies to the people of Liverpool for that headline. I too was totally misled, blah, 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 blah." But then, of course, what we hear is reported in private saying, "I told the truth then, and I'm still telling it now." And it went on, actually. And I want to reveal some more about the hidden hands behind that and why they decided that it was a good tactic to blame the fans for this awful, awful tragedy. So what happened, and I think this is very interesting, and there were loads of, people, if you were in England at the time, in the UK, but particularly in England, you would have felt the huge outpouring of grief about Hillsborough. We're still marked by, even to the degree that this month, Keir Starmer has put forward Hillsborough Law, which I'll talk about shortly. And huge outpouring of grief. And you had, there were charity records made. So for one example, Jerry and the Pacemakers, very famously a song associated with Liverpool. And in May 1989, there was a charity version of Ferry Across the Mersey, produced by Stock Aitken and Waterman, featured Paul McCartney, famously from Liverpool, Jerry Marsden of the Pacemakers, Holly Johnson, very famous Liverpudlians and the Christians. It entered the UK singles charts at number 1, remained at the top of the charts. And I think the idea had, I don't know whether originally or not, but some people wondered why they hadn't covered You'll Never Walk Alone. And that had actually been re-recorded for another appeal. So the outpouring from famous people, from producers, just people on the street towards Hillsborough was great, was absolutely great. And people had also attempted to mess with our understanding of what had taken place at Hillsborough by blaming the fans. So why did Hillsborough go so badly wrong? Okay. And it involves Freemasons. It involves Freemasons. So what you had was Chief Superintendent Brian Mole had previously been responsible for the previous year's FA Cup semi-final, which was also between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest and was also at Hillsborough Stadium. But he had been transferred from his duties just a matter of weeks before the Hillsborough disaster. So what happened is Mole, in October 1988, a probationary constable in Mole's division. So Mole is the senior boss overseeing these big events, but he was transferred out because this probationary PC came forward and said he was handcuffed, he was photographed, he was stripped by fellow officers in a fake robbery. This was a hazing prank, apparently. 4 officers resigned, 7 were disciplined over the incident, and Chief Superintendent Mole himself was transferred to the Barnsley division for what they said was career development reasons. And the transfer was done with immediate effect on the 27th of March 1989. Well, meanwhile, they were planning for the FA Cup, the second FA Cup semi-final at Hillsborough, which Mole would oversee. Now, he was an experienced officer, but he was removed from the task. He was also a Freemason. The first planning meeting for the semi-final took place on the 22nd of March, was attended by newly promoted Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield. Mole wasn't there. And there are no known minutes that exist about that meeting. And the thing is, even though Mole had been transferred out because, it's obviously not good to have it under your command, whether you know about it or not, but officers put in a situation where they think that they are involved in a robbery and they're stripped by other cops, and there's not good stuff that goes on, right? And so he had to be moved away because the optics of it looked bad. But so what they did is they put Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield in. He had no experience of managing a large ground like this. And Duckenfield, like Mole, was also a Freemason. They were both Freemasons. They had overall responsibility for policing at the match. And what was interesting was after the horror of Hillsborough, a year later, David Duckenfield actually became the worshipful master, the head of his local lodge, the year after the disaster. I think that's what's known as a reward for failure, is it not? And what happened, the reason why the media went after fans and blamed them and claimed they were responsible, is because South Yorkshire Police, which David Duckenfield and Mole were senior cops, they fed the press false stories, suggesting that football hooliganism and drunkenness by Liverpool supporters had caused the disaster. That's what they did. They had to take it away from the police interference. And there were a lot of problems, which I want to tell you about, right? The first coroner's inquest into the Hillsborough disaster completed in 1991. It concluded with verdicts of accidental death in respect of all the deceased. Families disputed the findings, fought to have the case reopened. In 1997, Lord Justice Stuart Smith concluded that there was no justification for a new inquiry. This was when people started to suggest that there were really serious issues. Was there Freemasonic interference in this? There were a number of private prosecutions brought by the Hillsborough Family Support Group against David Duckenfield and his deputy Bernard Murray, failed. In 2009, a Hillsborough independent panel was formed to review the evidence. There was Operation Resolve, which was formed to look into the cause of the disaster. And there was also an investigation by the Independent Police Complaints Commission to examine actions by the police in the aftermath. That's ridiculous. That is just quite... The IPCC is largely made up of former cops. So the police were marking their own homework, and there would be a sizable chunk of Freemasons within the IPCC as well. The inquest, really problematic. This was where David Duckenfield, I think to a degree, was forced to admit that he was a Freemason at the time of the tragedy. He had been for 14 years. He said he did not know. This is where their secrecy comes in. Even at the inquest, David Duckenfield said he did not know whether the chief constable of his force or other senior officers were Masons because it was not seen as acceptable to be a senior policeman and a Freemason. You trying to tell me you don't know who's in your local lodges? Come on now. Questioned about it, and also questioned about whether the fact that he was a Freemason was why he was given the role, given he had no experience of managing an event such as what happened at Hillsborough. Was it because he was a member of the Freemasons? Was he promoted because he was a member of the Freemasons? And Duckenfield replied, I would not know, but I would hope not. Nobody ever spoke to me about it. Right. Now, the problem is there was a young PC at the inquest called PC Maxwell Groom. He alleged that senior South Yorkshire police officers who were Freemasons orchestrated a Masonic conspiracy to shift the blame onto fans after the Hillsborough disaster. Maxwell Groom, as I say, constable at the time, said that after the disaster, the word inside the force was that Freemason officers held a meeting with the aim of blaming a non-Freemason superintendent. And Maxwell Groom said he had heard that a meeting had taken place in portable cabins at South Yorkshire Police's area office and was attended by Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield a day after the event. What we do know is that senior officers pressured junior officers to change their Hillsborough statements. We know that. Groom told the inquest that senior officers were pressurizing junior officers. And that the senior officers were terrified of criticism of the forces command, which is obviously largely involves this man, David Duckenfield. And Groom said a colleague, PC Brooks, called the inquiry team at West Midlands Police to complain it was a Masonic conspiracy that was taking place. They said that Groom said that he was duped into agreeing to change elements of his statement because he believed if he did not, he would never be called to give evidence to Lord Justice Taylor's official inquiry or to the first inquest. And his statement would be, and I'm quoting him, magicked away, dumped in a box, never to see the light of day again. He also was asked why in earlier accounts about the events on the day he did not include the rumoured meeting of Freemason officers, and he replied, basically, I'd have been committing professional suicide. And that has been corroborated over and over again by police that I've talked to who are not Freemasons. And they're like, you don't whistle blow because you're going up against, the lodge. And Groom said that he'd heard of the meetings between senior officers, said to have included Duckenfield and other superintendents. And he said, I'm unable to completely prove it, but I believe that most of them were Masons. This happened, as I say, the day after the event. And it's quite awful because what became apparent about Hillsborough, and there was a big hoo-ha about Freemasonry around Hillsborough. What became apparent was that there were these hidden hands behind the scene that were encouraging media to refocus their gaze on who was responsible and make sure absolutely that the actual Freemason who had huge responsibility for what took place on that day was not implicated. And Freemason links to Hillsborough was also, as I say, investigated by the IPCC. Not much point of that. There was, as I say, the inquest, which also dwelled on why Mr. Duckenfield was promoted to a position he appeared to be underqualified for, with responsibility for a large policing operation on the day of the match that he essentially knew nothing about. There were also very serious issues with the first inquest and allegations, again, of Freemasonic tampering. So what you had was the first inquest was the coroner was Coroner Popper. And the suggestion was that he was too close to the police. The inquest into the Hillsborough deaths were open and adjourned immediately after the disaster, resumed on 19th of November, 1990, absolutely proved controversial. As I say, the South Yorkshire coroner, Stephen Popper, started to limit information that could be put into the inquest. He limited, this is really bad stuff, right? Because all of this took place approximately from like 2:45 in the afternoon until, well after 3:15. So 3:30, 4 o'clock. But what the coroner, and it was after these times, after like 3:15, was to do with the emergency responses and the police involvement. But the coroner limited events up to 3:15 on the day of the disaster. 9 minutes after the match was halted and the crowd had spilt onto the pitch. And Popper said that the reason he did this was because the victims were either dead or brain dead by 3:15. Now, this decision, as you can imagine, really angered families. And many considered that the inquest was failing to consider the response of the police and other emergency services after that time. And that was why that first inquest returned the verdict of accidental death in 1991, much to the dismay of the bereaved. Absolutely devastating. They had been hoping for a verdict of unlawful killing, or at least an open verdict. But no, this was a an open and shut case. The families also wanted manslaughter charges to be brought against the officers who had been present at the disaster, including Duckenfield, which is why they had tried their private prosecution later, because they were forced to, because they were failed by the system. The families believed that Stephen Popper was far too close to the police, and they said so publicly. After the verdict, at least one of the family members, Barry Devonside, who had lost his son at Hillsborough, he said he witnessed Popper hosting a celebration party with police officers. But that wasn't only where Stephen Popper had limited information. And the thing is, if you have limited information at an inquest, that's it. It goes down in the public domain, and that is it. He'd also refused to hear evidence from two qualified Merseyside doctors who had actually been inside the stadium on the day. They had been critical of the chaotic emergency response. The views of both were excluded from Popper and then dismissed from the Taylor report into the Hillsborough inquiry. Shocking stuff. Shocking stuff. What I will say was that the later Taylor report blamed police and the grounds, Sheffield. And Taylor concluded that policing on the day broke down, and the main reason for the disaster was the failure of police control. But it took years to reach that, and that still wasn't enough. Attention was focused on the decision to open the secondary gates. The kickoff should have been delayed, but all of that was refused on the day. They refused to delay the kickoff, and it all just continued. And Lord Taylor noted with regard to the performance of the senior police officers in command that, and I'm quoting directly, neither their handling of the problems on the day nor their account of it in evidence showed the qualities of leadership to be expected of their rank. The truth was they closed ranks and they covered up for the Freemasons within their ranks so that they would not be blamed for that tragedy. That is what happened at Hillsborough. It is horrendous. And I cannot imagine what it would be like to have lost a loved one at Hillsborough, only to know that there was a cover-up that started immediately, within hours, immediately, which was obviously between, and I would suggest that this was a Freemasonic connection that went from the news report that got to the Sun, because there were also Freemasonry influences within newspapers, and none more so than at Murdoch's place. Any of his newspapers, none more so. Then, of course, we had the Hillsborough Independent panel. I mean, it actually went on. The Hillsborough Independent panel was instituted in 2009 by the British government to investigate the Hillsborough disaster, to oversee the disclosure of documents about the disaster and its aftermath. And what they realised was that South Yorkshire Police had doctored evidence. The panel concluded that no Liverpool fans were responsible in any way for the disaster, and that its main cause was a lack of police control. Crowd safety was compromised at every level, and overcrowding issues had been recorded 2 years earlier. And yet the two Freemasons who had been in charge of running that event for consecutive 2 years Mole was fine. Nothing had happened under his watch. And then he was removed because of the hazing situation. And then Duckenfield, another Freemason, was put in his place. And that's when everything occurred. And the panel concluded that up to 41 of the 96 who had died on that day might have survived had the emergency services reactions and coordination been better. There had been witness tampering. The findings concluded that 164 witness statements had been altered. 164 of those statements, 116 were amended to remove or change negative comments about South Yorkshire Police. This is tremendous amount of interference. South Yorkshire Police had performed blood alcohol tests on the victims, some of them children. They ran computer checks on the National Police database in an attempt to impugn the reputation of Liverpool fans. It was disgusting. And the MP involved in smearing fans was the Conservative MP for Sheffield Hallam, Irvin Patnick. He passed inaccurate and untrue information from the police to the press, including the horrendous lies told on the front page of The Sun. And as I say, Duckenfield was promoted following the tragedy. And as I say, there were private prosecutions, criminal and civil cases. Duckenfield lied. He admitted that he had lied in certain statements regarding the causes of the disaster. There was a prosecution. It ended in July 2000. Murray was acquitted. The jury was unable to reach a verdict in the case of David Duckenfield. On the 26th of July 2000, the judge refused the prosecution's application for a retrial of David Duckenfield. Police disciplinary charges were abandoned when Duckenfield retired on health grounds. It was decided not to proceed with disciplinary charges against Duckenfield or Murray. And Duckenfield took medical retirement on a full police pension. How horrendous for the victims of Hillsborough. Horrendous, absolutely horrendous. June 27, 2017, when they announced there were going to be charges, it went on and on. Duckenfield pleaded not guilty. And it just became quite ridiculous. Eventually, it was announced that Duckenfield would face a retrial. It was scheduled to start on the 7th of October at Preston Crown Court. And on the 28th of November 2019, Duckenfield was found not guilty of gross negligence manslaughter. He ordered the gates to be open, the fans to flood in, and that created the problem. He is absolutely responsible. But what they did was they did everything to protect the Freemasons within South Yorkshire Police and instead blame the fans, some of those fans who had helped to stretcher away the victims and dying. Absolutely heinous. More power to your elbow, Liverpool, for making sure that the Sun hardly is sold. More power to your elbow, Merseyside. More power to your elbow. And then, of course, I referred to it earlier, Hillsborough law. Keir Starmer, been involved in that, overseeing the introduction of the Hillsborough law. Finally, in 2025, it's a public authority accountability bill, and it has become known as Hillsborough law. It was proposed by bereaved families of a number of different disasters, including Hillsborough, including Grenfell. And the idea is public bodies and public servants, such as police, would have a duty of candor. You'd think they already should have, right? The legislation received its first reading in Parliament in September 2025. It aims to prevent future cover-ups by public officials and ensure justice for victims. Starmer's previously faced criticism about this. He's delayed it. He pledged to introduce the law by the 36th anniversary of the disaster, which was April this year. He insisted he wanted to take time to get it right. There have been lots of concerns from campaigners and MPs about civil servants watering down the bill. I wonder if the hand, the invisible hand in the background, has been involved in that. And Starmer and other government ministers, they framed the Hillsborough law as a measure to address institutional failures in a range of public disasters. Whether it actually is or not is a whole other story, but the fact remains very, very strongly, and that is whether that is introduced, but whether that will actually protect people in the future. The closeness of police and Freemasonry should never, not ever, be underestimated then as now. And we see it on a constant basis. And here's some perfect examples of it. You know, the black and white checker, right, that police wear, which has been in existence for a very long time. Let me just give you an example of it, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Somewhere here, where are you? There he is. Let's use the most senior cop in England and Wales, Mark Rowley, like the commander of the Metropolitan Police. Now, people who aren't even policed by the Metropolitan Police know Mark Rowley, because Mark Rowley, or Rowley, however you people pronounce it both ways, he has become somebody who is extremely problematic. This is a cop. Well, we covered him in Common Purpose, first of all, right? He's a common purpose man. But he's also a man who suggested that even talking about a two-tier society could be criminalized, because it puts police and politicians in danger. That's Mark Rowley. Mark Rowley, who got behind the idea that Christian Bruckner is the number one suspect in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. That's Mark Rowley. Now, the black and white checker that they wear, this is the Silito tartan. It's spread all across the world in police forces, from the streets of Australia in the 1960s to the uniforms of Chicago officers in the late 1960s. This is still, this Silito tartan of black and white checkers is still a part of UK policing. Officially, the story goes back to Scotland, where much of Freemasonry does. Okay. This is the Silito tartan. It was named after Sir Percy Silito. And Sir Percy Silito, I'm sure I've got a picture of Sir Percy Silito somewhere here. There he is. He was the chief constable of Glasgow, and which had been a major hub of Masonic activity for hundreds of years, and was the birthplace of the Scottish Rite. An important branch of Masonry, which we talked about at the start, had some very powerful members. It should be pointed out that Percy Silito was himself a director of Britain's MI5, which connected him very intimately to the elite establishments with the secret societies. So from 1972 onwards, within the United Kingdom, the original black and white Scottish version were just essentially spread throughout England and Wales. It is now used by all police forces in the UK. It is worn on peaked caps, as you can see here with Mark Rowley, baseball caps, equestrian helmets. And people are like, wait a sec, is that black and white check Freemasonic? Well, yeah, almost certainly it is. Almost certainly. They deny it, of course. And I think I said at the start, the whole idea of the black and white checker is from dark to light, right? That the light is overcoming the darkness. But that is all around, it's all around us, that Silito tartan. People like to say, no, it's just a Scottish tartan. Yeah, a Scottish tartan associated and brought in by a Freemason who was also part of MI5 and part of Scottish Rites. I find it impossible to believe that the black and white check that we see today is not associated with Freemasonry. Impossible. Sorry, not having it. And by the way, I wish you luck if you attempt to get any kind of information, freedom of information to do with this, to do with Freemasonry, membership of the police force, etc., etc. I tried and failed and was pointed towards a 2024 Freedom of Information request, because they'll do that. If you're trying to ask a similar question that's already been asked that they've answered, they'll point you to when it was previously asked. And there was a question asked on a Freedom of Information request last year. Are Freemasonry and membership of the police force still seen as compatible? And what steps are taken to test out whether police members are members of the organization? And the response was, it was very management speak. Each police force determines compatibility in associations that may be inappropriate with national guidance provided by the College of Policing. And the Metropolitan Police governs through a declarable association policy. This sets out relationships with individuals and professions which must be declared to ensure transparency and public confidence. However, guess which one is not included in that? So the current policy does not specifically require Freemasonry to be declared, which, given its long and toxic associations with British policing, is actually shocking. There's a general obligation, according to this Freedom of Information response, to disclose in any circumstances where there is a potential conflict of interest and the relationship. Oh, do me a favor. You would have thought, right, that the Hillsborough inquiry, allegations of Freemasonic cover-up, Daniel Morgan, the history of, what was his name? A Superintendent Moody, I think it was Ron Moody, but Superintendent Moody in the 60s, who, along with other Metropolitan Police cops who were in the dock of the Old Bailey because they were involved with works with a pornographer who's part of their local lodge. So this goes on a long, long time. And what's been quite shocking, actually, was because I wanted to find out whether their influence has, sort of ebbed away. And you would have thought, following all these things, certainly the Hillsborough, where it was absolutely abundantly clear that there was a Freemasonic cover-up and the aim was to blame the fans, right? That was absolutely abundantly clear. And so, as I've said, there's been a series of suggestions of transparency registers throughout Parliament. But what has actually happened in the intervening years is that Freemasons and the membership of Freemasonry has gone more undercover than ever before. Ever before. I mean, at least before Parliament were examining whether secret fraternities like the Freemasons were undermining trust in policing and the courts. They're not now. In 1997 to 1999, the Home Affairs Committee conducted an unprecedented inquiry into Freemasonry within the police and judiciary. And it culminated in strong recommendations, which is what I referred to earlier, to lift the cloak of secrecy. Yet decades later, many of those transparency measures have been watered down by civil servants or quietly shelved, even as fresh allegations have surfaced. And they concluded on the committee that the solution is disclosure. It made a landmark recommendation that police officers, magistrates, judges, and Crown prosecutors should be required to register membership of any secret society and that the record should be publicly available. In other words, no more hidden handshakes in positions of public trust. The government accepted it, but it all backfired. As I say, the United Grand Lodge of England, the governing body of Freemasonry, was not happy. Pushback, threats of legal action. And what we ended up with was transparency was blocked. Implementing these ideas proved almost impossible. Practical and legal obstacles emerged. Imagine that. You're trying to prove that there is Freemasonic corruption in the judiciary and legals are pushing back against you. How do you win that? However, there had been enough from the disclosures for people to make some sense of what was taking place, because the scheme had partly relied on voluntary disclosure, but only new appointees would be compelled to declare, which left thousands of sitting judges, magistrates, and officers to come forward on their own honor. The result was absolutely incomplete. It was very difficult to tell what was taking place. And by 1999, the whole thing had flopped. It was just almost impossible. Police were not prepared to disclose. Judges were not prepared to disclose. And the Lord Chancellor's department, which oversees judges, juries, had what they considered to be a marginally better uptake from judges. And by 1999, what we had learned was 263 judges admitted to being Freemasons, versus about over 4,000, in fact, to be precise, 4,744 stating they were not. But dozens and dozens of judges refused to disclose or never responded. Never responded. And what it told us was that Freemasonry had then, and still now, almost certainly, even though we have no idea what is really taking place because they will not disclose, and they have spent years, if not decades, finding ways not to disclose membership. But what we learned was that roughly 1 in 20 judges in England and Wales turned out to be a Freemason. That's astonishing. 1 in 20. The idea is that transparency, greater transparency, should eliminate suspicions. And, an upfront declaration, I'm in the Freemasons, that would immediately eliminate to a degree any suspicions. But no. And when there was a suggestion of mandatory disclosure, again, in the 1990s, they were hoping that there was going to be big reforms, but no, absolutely not. Transparency stalled again. And there was, this push for greater transparency. And honestly, by the time it got into the 2000s, the whole thing was just abandoned. And Freemasonry leadership, I think that was the turning point. That scared whatever, the judiciary, the government, or whatever Freemasons like the United Grand Lodge, they were like, we're going to sue, we're not having it. So Straw scrapped it. Not that I would imagine that he was ever greatly in for it anyway. Jack Straw, as I said earlier, dodgy character. And so what we actually have since then is no actual tracking of Freemasonry. Can you imagine that? It's having such a huge impact on British public life, and yet we have no clue how many public officials, be that politicians, police, judges, or whatever, are Freemasons. There was no law ever passed to compel officers to register lodge memberships. That has not happened. And honestly, the whole thing appears to have come full circle. It's like Hillsborough and the revelations that took place around Hillsborough and Freemasons never happened. And once again, we're on the path now where it's down to people like me, investigative journalists, the odd radical MP here and there. I mean, if you think that you are dealing with a radical MP, right, or former MP in the UK, ask them about this. Ask Andrew Bridgen, who claims to be a kind of outside MP. Ask Rupert Lowe. Ask them about what their thoughts on Freemasonry and whether it should be more transparent. Ask them if they are Freemasons. Because the reality is, a lot of people don't know. They're not on public show. And lack of records make it impossible for us to tell the influence on British public life. What we do know from little insight, Steve White, who was a former police federation leader, he said that reform in policing was being blocked by members of the Freemasons. Their influence in the service is stopping the progress of women and people from Black and minority ethnic communities. He whistle blew. He said that was happening. He said it was still very much an old boys club, primarily an old white boys club, which is when you look at even the whole team who are responsible for Freemasonry in 2025, they are all white, male, and middle to upper class. You know, these are the realities. Very little has changed. Very little has changed. And it's a long-term thing that Masons within the police have been accused of covering for fellow Masons, not even necessarily in the same force as them, in other forces as well, and also favoring them for promotion over more talented non-Mason officers. I mean, this has long been known. It's not just the police, though. And this is where I wanted to slightly turn to something a little bit different, because I really wanted to show the foundations of what's been happening in terms of the UK and how we are still absolutely influenced by Freemasonry, even though we're not allowed to know about it, which is astonishing, absolutely astonishing. So it isn't just the police, obviously. Freemasonry permeates every part of our world. And many people claim it is linked to Satanism. And that includes this man, for one example. Let me bring in an image of him. If I can just see him. Oops. Oh, here he is. What's the fascinating video with this man? This is Dr. William Schnobelen. I will put a link in the description to his video, which is available on YouTube. He is a former 33-degree Freemason. He revealed some of the darkest secrets of Freemasonry in this incredible interview. And he talks about the royal secret. Now, this is an area that I think Wake Up viewers may know something about. The royal secret is only known at his level of Freemasonry, which is you can live forever by sexually vampirizing children, in his words. In other words, we're talking about adrenochrome, right? He also says Freemasonry is the worshipping of Lucifer. It's as ungodly as you can get. He talks about young children being taken to lodges, placed on the stone slab, and abused, some even to death. Now, I have my own story to tell regarding this. I interviewed, may he rest in peace, Brian Clare. Brian Clare was somebody who came forward after during the Jimmy Savile revelations, and he had contacted me saying that he'd had this experience, that he had been abused by a former member of parliament in a ceremony like this. And I worked at the time for ITN, and I took a camera team to interview him, and it was a profound interview, to say the least, where Brian described being taken as a child. I think he was quite young. I think he was about 12, being taken as a child to Freemasonry Lodge, being put on a stone slab. And his allegation was that Sir Leon Britton, who had been a former Home Secretary, had abused him. That was Brian's allegation, in a very similar ritual that this Dr. William Schnoebelen is talking about. Very similar. And many have said that Freemasonry is absolutely anti-Christian, that Freemasons worship Baphomet, as one example. We see that a lot, don't we, in like the goat head, that we hear that Freemasonry is occult in nature. Certainly that's what this man is saying. And that when you get to a certain level, by the way, I mean, this is the interesting thing, because when you talk to Freemasons in the vicinity, right, in the local area or whatever, they're like, we're doing all this good and we're sorting out, impoverished children and the sick and disabled and everything. And they do at the local area. But that's not what this man is talking about. This man is talking about when you progress through the degrees. So I don't necessarily think that people at your local lodges are lying when they say, I don't understand, although clearly at those local lodges, that is where a lot of the police corruption was taking place. But I do believe that there are genuine souls who enter Freemasonry. I believe there are genuine souls who want to do good for the community. But once you start to progress through the ranks, you start to see an altogether different side about it. And there's lots of stuff online about this. Some of this is just far too graphic for me to get into. But one of the things that I think that I've talked about a lot over the years is to do with symbolism, because symbolism is everywhere. I can't remember who it was who said that symbolism will be their downfall, because it's everywhere. And it's a bit like any kind of cult, the need to be able to show other people that you are part of that cult. Now, quite famously, Beyonce and Jay-Z have long been rumored to be part of that cult, which sells itself to the devil. And in fact, this 33-degree Freemason talks about how you have to sell your soul to the devil if you want to progress. Okay, once you get up that high. And Beyonce and Jay-Z have long been rumored to have done that. And in fact, one of Beyonce's former band members came out and said, yeah, it's true. This is what she's like. She does rituals, all of that. So symbolism is absolutely everywhere. Now, this is a typical example. Now, if you imagine, this is, they like to say that this is the diamond to do with Jay-Z's Rockefeller business. Note Rockefeller, by the way, Rockefeller, right? He ain't a Rockefeller, but he called his business Rockefeller. And they like to say it's the diamond, but this almost certainly is the triangle. And the triangle, I mean, the triangle is huge in Freemasonry. It represents the great first cause, container of all things. And I've seen when Beyonce and Jay-Z and Rihanna have all stood on stage and got all the audience members to do the triangle, which, as I say, they say is a diamond. And or alternatively, it can be seen as a pyramid. The pyramid is not said to appear in regular Masonic imagery, but it does. It's absolute BS to say it doesn't. It does. There's the all-seeing eye as one example, sometimes called the eye of providence. It's used by Masons. And there are squillions of people, famous people, including the lady on the screen here, including people like Lady Gaga, you name it. So many people who do the one eye symbolism, okay, which is also the eye of Horus. But we see it all around us. Sometimes it's become so normalized, Freemasonic imagery, that people don't even realize that's what they're seeing. So, for example, at the Oscars this year, look at this scene. Perfect example, I think, of how it's the influence of Freemasonry is still huge, absolutely still huge. So actually, I'm going to use this one, right? So I can compare it. Right, the top is the Oscars stage. The bottom, I've done a slightly smaller picture, but you can clearly see this is Freemasonic. Clearly, absolutely 100%. That is Freemasonic. And of course, there's many people consider the issue of the Illuminati and Freemasonry to be one and the same. They're not one and the same. There are influences. The Illuminati obviously goes back to Bavaria. They used Freemasons lodges as meeting places. Illuminati attracted Freemasons, and there were members from high society who were said to be part of both the Illuminati and the Freemasons, and that included a number of very classic composers, including Mozart as one example. And a lot of people think that what is going on in the music industry is to do with the Illuminati, and all the influences are coming through together, and we are seeing this symbolism everywhere, from politics to entertainment. And as I say, in the entertainment industry, many theories have connected the Freemasons and the Knights Templar with worship of the devil. And we do see that often. A lot of the time, they do the goat head, the Baphomet. And we see the associations with the occult. And most recently, there's been a lot of talk around the death of Charlie Kirk to do with Freemasonry. Let me just bring in some imagery here. And of course, there'll always be people say that can't possibly be right. It doesn't make any sense. That's not right. Blah, 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 blah. Well, they will. But I want to bring in some imagery here. I think this is worth talking about. Erica Kirk. I have many question marks about Erica Kirk, but this is her with what we are told is her dead husband's hands. And she had a G ring on her. Well, so G, the letter G, holds a significant place in Masonic law. The letter G is a prominent symbol found in the square and compasses. It represents multiple concepts and most commonly the idea of kind of God and geometry. But some people say, no, she has that G because her daughter is called Gigi. Well, they might, but it might be that, and it might not be that. I don't know. But I also know that there are a lot of interesting things. For example, at Charlie Kirk's memorial, Trump referred to him as a master builder. Now, in Freemasonry, a master builder is not an official rank. It's a symbolic figure. It represents the highest skill and knowledge in architecture and construction. And bear in mind that Freemasonry is really all about building. And that's where it comes from. That's where it originates from, building and architecture. And so Trump called him a master builder. And the people were like, no, that's not right. That's not free. Isn't it Master Mason? Well, Master Mason is a thing as well, but Master Builder is also a thing in Freemasonry. And the title Master Mason is the third and highest rank within the basic degrees of Freemasonry, which we've already covered. And the term Master Builder relates to the broader historical context of Freemasonry. So Trump was making a Freemasonic statement there. They've always denied that, or they haven't denied. They've just never confirmed. This is the interesting thing. Neither confirm nor deny, which is also a part of Freemasonry, whether Trump is a Freemason. His behavior is often that of a Freemason, though. Difficult to tell, because if they're not going to confirm it, all we're left with is guesswork. I also want to bring in this. This was something, and I mentioned this earlier. I always thought this was very interesting. I don't know if you'll be able to see it from this image. I hope you can, because this is very telling. This was Jerry McCann, father of Madeleine McCann. You might not be able to tell from that sheet, but this was when, because obviously when anybody's daughter goes missing, the first thing you do is you mock up a sheet of how you're going to get things done. And he was very, very much focused on, this is how we're going to go about it. And the imagery used was Freemasonic. It was this wording. You can't see it hear that clearly. The image is still available online. This kind of diamond was Freemasonic. And he may not have been a Mason. I think his brother John was, and quite high up, allegedly. And I mean, I think to me, it seems absolutely no doubt whatsoever that those images are the square and compass that Jerry is using. But it goes on and on and on. And not everything I'm saying is necessarily right. This is just some of the things that potentially make it so. So the renaming, for example, of Twitter into X. And if you look at this imagery, I think this imagery is also interesting. Look at it compared to the square and compass. Could be wrong, could be right. Who knows? But worth talking about, I feel. There are numerous known conspiracies, obviously, attached to Illuminati, attached to Freemasonry, and they run all across the board. I think I've covered most of them today, and that is political. We've heard that the British judiciary is heavily infiltrated with Masons who give fellow Masons the benefit of the doubt in court. We've heard that repeatedly. And we've heard that Freemasonry is a front for world domination, the New World Order as one perfect example. We've heard that some prominent murders involved Freemasons, including, for example, US President John F. Kennedy. And there's so much. There's so much. Masonic conspiracy theories in mass culture is everywhere. And some people have suggested to me that when you get people like Beyonce and Jay-Z, when they do that imagery, they do that because they know it's going to create a lot of chatter, not necessarily because they sold their souls to the devil. But I would say to you, Jay-Z has sold something to someone because he was never considered the most talented rapper or artist. And yet the wealth that he and his wife have acquired, the sheer volume of awards, even their daughter, who is not an artist, has received an Academy Award, right? I would suggest that that is due to Masonic influences. So what can we conclude from all this? Most Freemasons will never scale the heights to see beyond the shiny veneer of being a help to society. They simply won't. Charity covers many sins. It is the most secretive of society. They have, as I said, permeated every area of our society, and every person alive today has been influenced by them and their cult for our whole lives. They have been everywhere. As I said at the start, royal influences, police influences, judicial influences, political influences, media influences, financial influences, entertainment industry, what we watch, what we don't watch. There is less transparency around Freemasonry than there was in the 90s, all by design. They have sunk back into the shadows. We are told they are charitable. We hear nothing about the corruption and cover-ups. I want to say today that what we need to do is we need to demand a list of public officials who are Freemasons. There should be no secretive club involvement when dealing with matters that impact the British public. And that includes from this one. There should be no secretive club membership whatsoever. It is scandalous that remains so, given everything I've outlined today. And this is all available to the authorities. This is available to all the people who have blocked it, including people like Sadiq Khan. The Freemasons, I started by saying, there is this idea that the Freemasons are depleting, that they no longer have the power or influence that they used to have. I would argue that they have more power and influence than ever before. We just don't know about it. And that tells you how powerful they are. That even when there have been corruptions exposed, they can still sink back into the shadows. That's a reality. Yes, it is. Catherine says the world is run by crooks. Indeed, the reality is they don't want us to know what's going on. They simply don't want us to know what's going on. And I believe we have every right, which is why. And you know what I did with this one? Normally I let my Patreons know the day before what we're going to be doing on the live investigation, but I didn't with this one because my contacts were quite clear, and that is you just don't announce it until you're ready to do it. And totally run by demons. Thank you, Marco. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you all for being here, by the way, and for your very kind super chats. Thank you, Swiss Miss. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Gemma. Thank you, Bex. Bringing proper journalism back. Indeed, my darling. Indeed, that is the aim. Gwyneth, thank you. Says, thank you, Sonia. Hillsborough and the determination of family and friends have revealed so much about the vile corruption and collusion of the establishment. Absolutely. I will never forgive the Sun newspaper for what they did. These were grieving fans. They turned on them. Thank you, Marie. I very much appreciate it. Thank you, Marco. Thank you all for your kindness and your generosity. Thank you for being here today. Thank you very, very much. You're welcome, Trev. Absolutely. And of course, these are my wonderful Patreons. They get away with it because no one really gives a, says Paul. And yeah, but we need to, right? We need to. We have every right to. Thank you, Baz. I appreciate that very much. And thank you all for being here. And thank you for listening. If you've managed to last for this period of time, over 2 hours today, but thank you all. Thank you to all my patrons. Thank you to everybody who donates and contributes to Wake Up and makes deep dives like this possible. Thank you, Ray J. I very much appreciate that. Stella says another grand rising banger. I appreciate you all. Thank you, Short Order Cook. Thank you all of you. You're amazing. Thank you. I will see you Monday. We will be back as normal. It will be Newsday on Monday, and we will be talking about digital ID, which will be everywhere, all over the press this weekend after Starmer's announcement. Take good care of yourself. Thank you very much for being here and for your support. Lots of love to you. See you Monday. Oops. Wait, it's not letting me. It doesn't even want me to end the stream, people. Look at that. It doesn't want me to end the stream. I'm trying my best. There you go. See you Monday. Take care.